Hello everyone, I'm Spalding Nix of Spalding Nix Fine Art, and today we are going to be discussing paintings in and of Georgia from the 18th and 19th century. This presentation is called Inspired by Georgia. I think Georgia has a unique art history that I'm excited to discuss with you. So let's get started. All right, so our first slide is one of my favorite American paintings, Washington Crossing the Delaware. And this illustrates the history of painting in Georgia. Very much mirrors the history of painting throughout the United States during the 18th and 19th century. So a lot of the developments that we see in American painting during this period, they're echoed here in Georgia. There's 4 themes that I'd like for you to remember while we are making this march through 200 years. And the first one is about portraiture. Portraiture is the first type of paintings that we see in Georgia, and it's really about this civilizing importance of portraiture. What does that mean? That means that Georgia was a very chaotic place in the 18th century, and people wanted to present themselves as civilized individuals, and paintings, portraiture, allowed them to do that. The next theme that we're going to be looking at is the role of sublime landscape painting. This is really the first truly American art movement. It's not reflecting what's happening in Europe. This is reflecting what's happening in our own country. These are the landscape paintings leading up to the Hudson River School, and really a celebration of our new country. The third theme that we're going to be discussing is the significance of scientific naturalism and realism. So what does that mean? That means naturalism, presenting things as they are, and then realism, presenting them as how we see them, which was very much in contrast to what was happening in Europe in the late 19th century when we had Impressionism taking hold. And then by the end of the 19th century, we're looking at this new sense of poetry and emotion at the center of American art. Here we have Winslow Homer's Breezing Up, which I think is such a wonderful late 19th century, post-Civil War, optimistic, capturing the optimistic spirit of America during that period. We're going to begin in the early 18th century. We are talking about Georgia being founded in the 1730s by Oglethorpe. It was the last of the original 13 colonies to be established, named after the great King George II. But the first people off the boat in Savannah were not portrait painters. Usually takes a little while for civilization to reach a level where artists are needed. First you need the ironworkers and the shoemakers and those people, but eventually, as things settle into a more civilized rhythm, people seek out these artists to fill their homes. So what do we have? We have American painters really looking to Europe for inspiration, for example. So what we see in these early American painters, they're either being trained in Europe and moving to the United States to paint portraits of wealthy aristocrats or the emerging middle class. There are very few early American paintings from the 17th century and the early 18th century, but Georgia is unique, and let me tell you why. In 1736, a young German prince who was fascinated by the New World decided that he was going to come and see it for himself. So he traveled from Germany to New Ebenezer, which was a colony founded by the Georgia Salzburgers. And the Salzburgers were Protestants who had been expelled from a very Catholic Salzburg in 1731. So this prince, at the age of 25 years old, sails from Germany to Georgia to see this brave new world. Here we can see the location of New Ebenezer, just up the river from Savannah. And what's amazing about New Ebenezer is that the church that was built there by the Georgia Salzburgers in 1769 still stands. It was one of the few buildings still standing after the Revolutionary War, and amazing that it still stands today. You can check it out the next time you're on your way to Savannah. But what made this trip so unique was not only did this prince have an interest in this brave new world, but you can see in our next slide, he was a pretty good artist, and he kept a diary of all the things that he saw. So he's creating watercolors of all the things that impressed him as he experiences Georgia in the 1730s. So here we have this wonderful watercolor of a sliced watermelon. We've got about 50 watercolors in this journal that has survived, and it really shows us what impressed him in the world that he saw when he visited Georgia in the 1730s. I love this next slide. This one page, we have snakes, we have seeds, and we have this beautiful depiction of an alligator. Imagine coming from Germany and seeing an alligator for the first time. And you can just tell how excited he is about this creature and this wonderful watercolor that he creates. In the next slide, you can see his depiction of butterflies and blue jays. It looks like a blue heron. Just wonderful examples, one after another, of the flora and the fauna here in Georgia. This next page, you can see has an impressive watercolor of a magnolia, its blossom. What's interesting is, in addition to the flora and the fauna of Georgia, we also have these great depictions of Indians in Georgia in the 1730s. And there were many groups of Indians in Georgia at the time, a lot of them having been expelled from Florida or North Carolina. The Yuchi Indians were in Georgia at the time, and it appears that Friedrich von Reck, the prince, spent time with them. The Yuchi Indians, again, these refugee tribes in the early 18th century who had been displaced from other places by the European settlers. Here we have this wonderful watercolor of a Yuchi Indian war dance. Just a wonderful snapshot of Indian life in 1736. I love this double portrait. We have the queen on the left, and on the right we have the king of the Yuchis. And what is the king wearing? He's got this bear fur cape around his shoulders, but what does his wife have around her shoulders? It's a European blanket. So you're already seeing the influence of the Europeans on these Indians. And obviously, the queen showing this blanket off as sort of her prized possession already, what sort of great influence the settlers are having. I love this portrait. This is of the sort of supreme commander, the head general of the Yuchi army, we'll say. But look what he's wearing. He's got these wonderful tattoos. He's got this war paint on his face, but he has on a European shirt. And he has on European leggings. And it appears that he has on European shoes. So again, by the 1730s, already that influence on the Native American Indians. This manuscript, this diary that the prince kept, is in the Center for Manuscripts and Rare Books at the Royal Library of Copenhagen, Denmark. So next time you're seated next to the director of the Atlanta History Center or the Bill Island at the Georgia Museum of Art, bend their ear and say what a fun show it would be to get this manuscript to Georgia. There's so much that we could all learn from this wonderful book. So the next artist we're going to look at is Jeremiah Theus. He is best known for his portrait work. So again, going back to that first theme that we discussed of Georgia and Charleston's, then Charlestown, the wealthy residents there. He was born in 716 in Switzerland, and at the age of 19, sailed to South Carolina, where he set up shop at the corner of Broad and Meeting Street. And here you can see the kind of portraits he was doing, very much influenced by portraiture, 18th century portraiture in England. He had very little competition. He was one of the only portrait artists working in Charleston and the Southeast at the time. We know of at least 200 portraits that are attributed to him. And still, with every great estate that's being sold at auction, portraits still coming out of the woodworks that he has created. He sort of worked in a 100-mile radius around Charleston, so he traveled to Savannah and Augusta to complete commissions. And by 1744, there was enough demand in Charleston for him to open a drawing school for young gentlemen and ladies. So, what do we have here? I love this portrait of James Habersham, the namesake of Habersham Road here in Buckhead. And we can see a lot of the characteristics of the Theus painting in this portrait of Habersham, who served as Georgia's acting colonial governor in the 1770s. But a lot of Theus's portraits, you see this very much elongated features. We've got the eyes very close together, usually a half length, so about to the waist for his portraits. And he usually hides hands. I always say you can tell a great artist from their depictions of hands and feet, but Theus chooses to hide the hands. But what does he show off? He is very good at painting the luxurious clothing and jewelry of his wealthy clients. So here we have again that idea, the civilizing importance of portraiture, presenting themselves as their best selves, as their most civilized, as most wealthy. So how did Theus achieve this? Well, we can see in this wonderful portrait of Captain John Reynolds of the British Navy. He was Georgia's first royal governor. But look at this. We've got the strength of the pillar in the background. We've got this incredible coat with all of this gold embroidered and gold embroidery, even the gold on the back of his ship, the Arundel, which was in Charleston at the time, defending the city from pirates. That's what he's highlighting. So again, bringing that wealth, that idea of being civilized to these portraits. So again, how do you do this? Well, Theus was successful because of his use of contemporary popular portraits in England as his jumping off point for his portraits here in the Southeast. So how did he do this? Here we have a portrait at the Gibbs Museum of Art. You can see this beautiful woman here in her very fancy gown. But here on the right, what is this? This is a mezzotint of a portrait that was very popular in the mid-18th century in England. And a mezzotint is a type of intaglio print. Take a very hard-tipped utensil, scratch it into the plate, and make endless prints with it. A very inexpensive way for people to know what was fashionable, what was happening in England at the time. So Theus had these prints brought to Charleston. You could then go to his studio, pick a composition that you liked, and then he would put your head on the body of the person depicted in the mezzotint print. So here we have this beautiful woman whose head has been placed on this body inspired by the mezzotint print. I do love that he takes it a step further. He adds this airline trim. He adds this really over-the-top jewelry and puts flowers in her hair. But you can see what a great job he's doing, making his clients happy by presenting themselves perhaps in clothing and jewelry that they never owned. And you can again see the effects of this. Here we have a mezzotint print, and then a group of paintings based on this print. So we've got multiple women who have chosen this print as the inspiration for their picture, and Theus has just put their different heads into each composition. Theus was very successful as a portrait painter in the mid-18th century here in the Southeast. This painting here shows falling rose petals, probably a portrait of a child who had passed away. Again, I can't emphasize enough how volatile Georgia was in the 18th century. We had the Spaniards to the south. We had multiple Indian tribes in Georgia. It was a very chaotic place. And Theus is offering us the opportunity to present ourselves in a civilized way. When he died in 1774 in Charleston, his death was noted in multiple newspapers. Beside his house, he owned 200 acres in Orangeburg and owned 7 slaves and had cash holdings of over 3,000 pounds. And that's a lot of money for a portrait painter at that time. So he was wildly successful amongst the Charlestonians and the wealthy Georgians in the 18th century. The next artist we're going to discuss is one of my favorites, John Abbott. He is best known as a naturalist artist. He spent nearly 65 years in Georgia and really advanced our knowledge of the flora and fauna of Georgia during this period. He's best known for his watercolors of birds and of insects. And I want everybody to remember that he was born 34 years before John James Audubon. So really a generation before Audubon, who deserves the recognition that Audubon achieved and was definitely an influence on Audubon. So John Abbott was born in London in 1751. He studied for 4 years as a clerk to become a lawyer, but eventually decided that wasn't where his passion was. His passion was for collecting and breeding insects and for fine art. He sort of combined his interest in science and in art to become a collector of these insects who were very desirable curiosities at the time. He eventually decided to sail to Virginia. He got out his globe and looked for the shortest passage from London to the New World. While on the ship, he met a couple who said, "Come join us up the James River." He settled there, lived for 2 years, collecting birds, collecting insects, and then working as a taxidermist, preserving them, and then shipping them back to London, where these insects were so desirable they were being sold in jewelry stores. You can think of a curiosity cabinet filled with these things. And also, he was sending back his watercolors of insects and of birds that could then be made into engravings and distributed in Europe. So, but his entire livelihood was based on selling things to people in Great Britain. And what happened in 1775, where we have the beginning of the Revolutionary War, his clientele, or access to his clientele, disappears. At that time, he decides to move down to Burke County, just outside of Augusta, where he sets up shop, and he creates one of the first important books about insects in North America. It's called The Natural History of the Rarer Lepidopterous Insects of Georgia. It's really the first major work on North American insects, and it's stunning. I spent a few afternoons with it at the Rare Books Library at Emory. I really encourage everyone to go see it. These beautiful hand-colored prints that were made based on John Abbott's watercolors. Really stunning. John Abbott lived in Georgia for about 65 years, eventually settled in Bullock County, which is down by Statesboro. He produced more than 4,000 original watercolors depicting Georgia's flora and fauna. Most of these were sent back to Europe. I think that's one of the reasons why he's less well known than someone like John James Audubon, because a lot of his work was shipped back to Europe, and a lot of it was unsigned. So a lot of his pieces were made into prints, and the watercolors were unsigned, and he just did not get the recognition that he deserved. But we still see a lot of his pieces coming out of private collections here in Georgia, and his watercolors. I love this one we had in the previous slide. Have so much character and very collectible today, and selling for $15,000 to $20,000. So now we're in the 19th century, and we were looking at American painting, again, thinking about those themes that we discussed at the beginning, that idea of sublime landscape painting, really much influenced by the idea of naturalism that we talked about, presenting things as we see them, but also this idea of romanticism. There's this the beginning of the Hudson River School, where we're presenting these idealized American landscapes. And one artist who definitely is influenced by all this, and an influencer, is George Cook. He was one of the self-taught itinerant painters of portraits and landscapes here in the Southeast in the early to mid-19th century. And really, he is one of those American painters who is leading up to the Hudson River School. He's our first artist that we've discussed, who was born here in the United States. He was born in Maryland in 1791. And I said earlier that he was self-taught. There weren't many opportunities in the 18th century to learn how to be an artist here in the United States. You had to go to Europe. And so George Cook, at the age of, in his 30s, he decided to travel to Europe with his wife to see all of the great paintings. And at the time, in order to become a great artist, one of the ways he did it was by copying the old masters. So he went to Europe in the 1820s. He was there for 5 years, traveling to Rome, traveling to London, traveling to Paris, and copying the old masters. What's interesting is that he not only copied the acknowledged old masters at that time, but he also chose to copy contemporary artists as well. And there's a great story about him producing a copy of Jericho's 1819 masterpiece, The Raft of Medusa, which was a highly controversial painting when it was created in 1819. And here is the painting. It was eventually deposited and given to the New York Historical Society and miscatalogued, and was recently found and is now being restored. Here you can see the painting right after it had been rediscovered. What makes this painting important is that it was very much a critique of the French monarchy at the time. The painting depicts a raft filled with dead and dying sailors who were on this ship, the Medusa, that was sailed by a captain appointed by the king who was inexperienced. The ship had problems, started with 150 people. By the time an English ship found it on this raft that's depicted here, there was 14 people left. They had resorted to cannibalism to stay alive, and everyone, it was very much a symbol of criticism for the monarchy. And I think it's fascinating that George Cook decided to paint this painting, bring it back to the United States so that people could see it. It was very much celebrated when he brought it back. People had only seen it in France, and they had, not to scale, the original is enormous, but this is about 6 feet wide and a very good copy. And it's hard to remember, in the 19th century, a great painting, a controversial painting, people would line up, just like you go to the movies today, and pay money to see a picture like this. So it was a sensation when he brought this painting back. Again, a self-taught artist, and I think one of the most ambitious artists that I can imagine from this period. I hope that everyone has seen his painting of the interior of St. Peter's at the University of Georgia. It's in the Georgia Chapel. Next time you're at a game and you've got your red plastic cup in your hand, walk into the chapel. You will see one of the largest paintings in the world created by George Cook of the interior of St. Peter's. He completed this painting in 1847 for the industrialist Daniel Pratt. He was building an addition to his home in Prattville, Alabama, and he wanted this painting to be at the end of the hallway. So if you were standing at his house and you looked down the hall, it looked like it kept going on forever into the interior of St. Peter's. This painting is 17 feet tall and 23 and a half feet wide. It's just an incredible, very ambitious project for a self-taught painter. here in the Southeast in the mid-19th century. When it was given to the University of Georgia by Cook's wife in the mid-19th century, they actually had to enlarge the chapel just to squeeze it in. Our next slide, I love this picture. This is a painting that he did of a view of Athens from Carr's Hill. And you can see the railroad only went so far, and you've got Athens on the hill in the distance. A lot of buildings in downtown Athens you can see here from the 1840s. That in the 1840s, he visited Georgia for the first time and decided to settle in Athens. And this is where his portrait painting career really took off. So this is 20 years or 15 years before the Civil War. He becomes one of the most well-known portrait painters here in the South. Again, that ambition, when you see his pictures, it's rarely like Theus's, where he's got his hands are being hidden in a very simple backdrop. These, like in this picture here, very complicated compositions. I love this next slide, with these two children being presented in this window. That idea of romanticism, naturalism, very much influencing this painting. Another great portrait, this woman here with her guitar. And again, look at this complicated pose that she's in, the guitar, the backdrop, the landscape in the back. Again, these layers that Cook is adding to these paintings, making them more and more complex. I always like to touch on restoration and conservation, because a lot of these paintings, they've been hanging in someone's dusty dining room for the last 100 years, and they're dark, and the paint's peeling off, and the old lady scares the grandkids. That's not the way the paintings were originally meant to be seen. A lot of times these paintings are just hiding under layers of dirt and old varnish. And here you can see in this slide, this wonderful portrait that Cook did, how much it was brought back to life after it was restored, as well as this beautiful portrait here. So you're thinking about what to do with a painting that needs some TLC. Remember that you're responsible for this painting during your life. It's been around for a long time. Make sure you take good care of it. And I can help you with some restores if you need it. Again, George Cook, being a self-taught artist, him striving to reach the same standards as those academically trained painters in Europe, balance, order, harmony, that idealization, that romanticism that he brings to his work, very much embodies the ambitious American painter of the early 19th century. So right now, we've made it all the way up to the Civil War, and we see the popularity of genre painting as that middle class continues to emerge. That's the sort of paintings they were looking for their home, paintings of things that they knew, paintings of the landscape and people around them. One of the great genre painters from this period, you can see here in our next slide, William Aiken Walker, very much a chronicler of the post-bellum South, depicting the world that we were creating for ourselves in the wake of the war. This is our first artist born here in the South. He was born in 1831 in Charleston. He was part of that tradition of the successful itinerant painter. He enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1861 and worked as a draftsman preparing maps and sketches for the Confederacy. After the war, he was the true itinerant painter in that he pretty much had a circuit from Charleston to New Orleans, following the major port cities, the railroad towns, and he found his audience really amongst the tourists, the notable patrons throughout the region, but setting up on the street corner in a new town with a suitcase full of small works depicting these genre scenes that were popular, and really selling them 50 cents, $1 to people as they walked by. Most of his paintings are very small compositions. They're always coming out, been stuffed in the bottom of a chest of drawers, and lots of his pictures are resurfacing. You'll see the same imagery, the same compositions over and over again, these idealized scenes of city and country life, often these very sentimental figures, a lot of African-American farmers, newspaper boys, a lot of cabin scenes, everything, again, being influenced by that romanticism and idealization that we saw with Cook. But very collectible today. These pictures, even these small, really almost the size of a postcard, these paintings can sell for $8,000 to $10,000 at auction today. Some people have a problem with Cook. A problem with William Aiken Walker because of that sort of sentimental attitude that he took. Are his pictures, are they too nostalgic in the wake of the Civil War? Are they really capturing life during Reconstruction? I'm not sure, but if you spend time with his biography, I think you'll be fascinated by his character. Everywhere he went, he had friends and patrons who would take care of him and parties to celebrate him. And I just love the idea of this itinerant self-taught artist constantly traveling, setting up his suitcase on street corners in Reconstruction South. Well, to end it up, I wanted to include this great painting of a shoe covered in mice from the Louisiana State Museum. I think you can see William Aiken Walker's humor in a picture like this. So here we are, we've made it to the end of the 19th century. One of my favorite American painters is George Ennis. He's very much coming out of the Hudson River School, that second generation of painters after the Hudson River School. He had health problems, and he was from the Northeast, and his doctor said, well, I think it would do you well to spend time in Florida. I think that weather might help your health condition. So in the 1880s, he made numerous trips to Florida with extended stays in Georgia on his way south. And this very much, this poetic, this very emotional type of paintings that he's doing, it's all about spiritual. He brought that to some of the paintings that he created here in the Southeast. And here we have an artist very much looking to the developments in Europe. We're talking about the Barbizon School, we're talking about the Impressionists, and bringing this style to the southern landscape. One of my favorite paintings that has ever been done of Georgia is this painting here of the Georgia pines. This was done in 1890. My father's from Buckhead, Georgia. Growing up, going to visit his family there, seeing those, endless landscape of pine tree farms, and all those vertical lines, orange, and then at the top, everything green, very much captured right here in this beautiful painting by Ennis. I've seen this painting at the Smithsonian in DC, and I had it as my screensaver for years. I just think it captures the South and the spiritual side of the South so well. So please make a special trip to DC to check it out. The last painter we're going to discuss is Henry Osawa Tanner. He is really the first African-American painter to gain international acclaim. He was born in Pittsburgh in 1859 and studied under the great Thomas Aikens at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. So here we've made it to the end of the 19th century. There are opportunities to learn as an artist in the United States for the first time. I think it says a lot about Aikens that he respected Henry Osawa Tanner so much that he did a portrait of him. That's this portrait here. Tanner is most well known for these types of paintings. Again, that sort of poetic, emotional, spiritual type of paintings that were popular in the late 19th, early 20th century. In 1888, he moved to Atlanta and opened a photography studio and painted portraits and taught at Clark University. He did landscape paintings of the southern landscape in the wake of the Civil War during the Reconstruction era. This painting is at the Morris Museum of Art. If you haven't visited the Morris, Please check it out. It's in Augusta. They have an incredible collection of paintings relating to Georgia and Georgia's art history. This painting is so tragic in person, this twisted landscape. Here we have an African American from the north painting the Georgia landscape in the wake of the Civil War. Really lots and lots of layers there. After having his first solo exhibition here in Atlanta in the 1890s, Tanner decides to move to Paris, where he becomes established as an academic and religious painter, won some of art's most prestigious awards at the time. I love this story about J.J. Haverty, the founder of Haverty Furniture Company here in Atlanta, who was instrumental in establishing the High Museum of Art in the 1920s. He went to Paris to buy paintings for the High Museum of Art and visited Tanner's studio and bought several paintings for the High's permanent collection. If you go to the High Museum today, you can see these paintings. They're always on display. But I just love the idea of this successful Southern businessman, J.J. Haverty, discussing probably with Tanner Atlanta in the 1880s, 30 years ago. Then we're uniting in Paris. So, again, the importance of patronizing in museums. Haverty did it. I challenge all of y'all to be the next J.J. Haverty. Find those great contemporary artists to add to these permanent collections. So we have made it. That's 200 years of paintings in and of Georgia from the 18th and 19th centuries. I hope that you enjoyed this illustrated history lesson, and I hope that you will spend some time researching these artists and spending time with their works at the High Museum, at the Georgia Museum of Art, the Morris in Augusta, at the Gibbs in Charleston. So many wonderful opportunities to celebrate these great painters inspired by Georgia. Thank you.